All right. So we left off, and you guys probably already have this filled in, but I just want to sort of review it to get us back on track here. So we're talking about plants, and there's different groupings of plants. What we're talking about now are called Angiosperms. These are the flowering plants, plants that produce flowers for reproduction. And so these plants that we call flowering plants, they have flowers. They contain both male and female reproductive organs. And there are some plants have flowers with only male parts. Some plants have flowers with only female parts. Some have both in the same flower. It depends on the type of plant. These are the reproductive structures. Okay? And these flowers eventually, after pollination, produce seeds. And seeds are basically like an embryo of a plant. They will grow into a new organism. So when we look at flowers, what we think of as a flower, we have different parts. You're going to have to know about these parts. So look at this model of a flower. The green petals on the bottom sort of support the flower, the base of the flower, called the sepals. Okay. Help protect the flower, give it its basic structure. The other parts are on the outside. Those are called the petals, obviously. Often these petals are adapted to attracting pollinators, animals that will come visit the flower and help pollinate, which we talked about this week. And then there are the reproductive cells, the sex cells, the gametes. Male gamete is in the pollen. Female gamete is in the ovule. And in order for a plant, or any animal, or any organism that reproduces sexually to reproduce, the male and female sex cells need to combine in a process that we call fertilization. Fertilization happens in plants when the pollen grain lands and fertilizes the ovule. So plants, flowers are the part that's used for sexual reproduction in plants. Okay? And it requires two parents. One provides the male sex cell, one provides the female sex cell. One provides the pollen, one provides the ovule. And if you remember from when we talked about sexual reproduction, the advantage of sexual reproduction over asexual reproduction is that it adds variety to the species. It increases variation. Because the offspring that are produced through sexual reproduction are not identical to either parent. They have a mixture of traits. They have new combinations of characteristics from each parent. But plants also can reproduce asexually in lots of different ways. We have a plant, and what happens is the root grows underground, and then popping up from that root in various places are new plants. But they are genetic copies of this original plant. Okay, they are not produced through sexual reproduction. This is a form of asexual reproduction. They're just copies of the original. Example of something that reproduces, you can't read it beneath this thing, is grass. Grass reproduces asexually often. It sends these little runners under the ground, which then pop up to form new grass both friends. So let's look at the parts of the flower. Talk about what they're called and what their function is. So often in a flower, what you'll see is there are both male and female parts in a single flower. It's not always the case, but it often is the case. Okay. So if we're looking at the male parts of the flower, we're looking at this sort of model. These are the male parts of the flower. These are the male reproductive organs. Okay? The whole thing is called a stamen. And the stamen, so here I took off a single stamen from this flower. And it's made of actually two parts. There's this top part, the anther, and then this long sort of stalk called the filament. Okay. This anther is where pollen is produced. So the pollen comes from this part of the top. That's the male sex cell, the male gamete. The filament is this long sort of stalk that holds the anther away from the base of the flower. The female reproductive organs in the flower is this part. The whole thing, this whole unit, is called the pistil. It's also made of other parts. Okay? The top part is called the stigma. Up here, this top part. The elongated part, okay, that's called the style. And then this round part at the bottom is called the ovary. The stigma, the top, this is where pollen would land. If this is going to be pollinated, this flower, pollen needs to land on this stigma. The style basically holds that stigma up in the air. And then the ovary down at the bottom, what do you think it contains, the ovary? Yeah, basically the egg, the ovule, we call them in plants. They're found in that ovary. So those are the parts of the flower, both male and female. If we look at another view of it, this is a lily. And different flowers have different arrangements, different numbers of petals, different numbers of stamens and so forth. Just depends on the type of flower. We'll be looking at some flowers later this week. But this is what one actually would look like. Again, you have the sepal, the green leaves on the bottom. You have the petals. In this case, they're orangish. You have a bunch of stamens. You have 6 stamens here. Each one has an anther at the top, and it's held up by a filament. In the middle, Okay, you have the pistil, this whole thing, stigma on top, style, the ovary, and then within the ovary, those little round ovules, which are the egg cells. So again, flowers are the reproductive structures of a plant. And they come in all sorts of configurations. Okay. Again, you have the sepals, which are these outer ring of leaves. They help protect the plant. The flowers don't immediately start open up. They often start closed up, protected by the sepals. And then once the timing is correct, that flower starts to open up. The sepals start to open up in the petals. The petals are basically leaves. They're often different color, brightly colored or with a different pattern, but they're really basically leaves. Okay? And they're brightly colored often to attract pollinators. And as the flower opens up at the right time of the year, it exposes the reproductive structures underneath, okay? Which are the stamens and the pistil. You can see that. So this is a tulip, right? Close up. You can see obviously the petals. Okay? You can see the stamens around the outside. Okay. You could see the anther of the stamen. And you could see it looks like all sort of granular, all powdery. What is that powdery stuff there? That's the pollen. And you may have noticed in the springtime around your house when trees are flowering and releasing that pollen, it gets all over things, like maybe on your driveway is all yellow, or it might collect on cars that are in your driveway. That's pollen. It's blowing around through the air. Those are plants that are, the pollen is spread through the wind. So they release a huge amount of pollen, gets blown around, and eventually might land on the female parts. Okay, again, that's the pistil. This is the pistil. Okay, you can see it there. Stigma, where pollen grains would land to fertilize that flower. Again, this is a lily. Looks a little different, but it's the same parts. Again, you have the pistil, and then the stamens are on the outside. And so the purpose of these parts is for pollination. What does that mean, pollination? For a flower to be pollinated. Yeah?
It's kind of like how they reproduce, like a reproduction cycle.
Yeah, it's like their reproduction in plants. It's sort of equivalent to fertilization in animals. So when a sperm cell meets an egg cell, the egg's been fertilized, and it produces eventually an embryo. The equivalent in plants is pollination. A male pollen grain lands on the stigma in the female parts of a flower and eventually combines with the ovule and produces offspring. So that's what pollination is. Pollen being transferred from anther to the stigma. Now there are some times when plants self-pollinate. What that means is that pollen from one flower fertilizes the stigma of that same flower. But self-pollination is actually not that common because it doesn't provide the same variation that sexual reproduction does, because it's one individual fertilizing the same individual. So it's not adding a lot of variation to the species. Cross-pollination is more common. That's when pollen from a different plant fertilizes a flower. Cross-pollination introduces more variation for the species. That fertilization takes place here in the ovary. A pollen grain lands on the stigma, a tube grows down into the ovary, and then a sperm cell goes down and fertilizes that ovule. Jordan?
Can't the bees also help?
Excuse me?
Can't the bees also help?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. So self-pollination is when pollen goes from the stigma of the stamen of one plant onto the stigma of the same plant. Cross-pollination is when the pollen grain fertilizes a different flower from a different individual. Okay, and cross-pollination has some advantages because, like I said, it produces variation. It adds variety to the species, shuffles the deck of the genes and chromosomes. And if we think back to natural selection, which we talked about earlier in the year, the first part of natural selection, there must be variation. And so variation is important in natural selection. With variation, and we had the struggle for survival, which not all organisms can survive and reproduce. Which ones do survive? Which organisms can survive in natural selection? Lindsay? The best adapted. The ones that have the most beneficial traits. Okay? And if they can survive, that means they can then what? Reproduce. And pass those genes on to the next generation. And over time, that leads to adaptations. And so sexual reproduction is important because it produces the variation that natural selection relies on. Self-pollination is not adding variation. All right, any questions up to that point? We're going to stop with our notes for right here.